So now we're coming to chapter 2, and we have this recognition of Paul's authority by the pillars, and rebuke of Peter substantiates Paul's authority. So let's just dive in. Then after 14 years, so notice he's, well, let me finish the verse. I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along also. Notice he's being very careful about chronology, right? We saw here, then after 3 years, his independence, right? Then 14 more years. The 14 years, I just want to say, just a technical word, we don't know if he's counting the 14 years from his conversion or the 14 added to the 3. Most scholars think that it's from his conversion, but it's hard to be sure. And then also it's a little bit difficult because Jews reckon years inclusively, so 14 years could really be 12. You see what I'm saying? Because it's like Jesus was raised on the 3rd day, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, right? That's 3 days. It depends on how you count days. So people count days in different ways. So we don't have to worry about that. If you're writing a Pauline chronology, that becomes an issue. But the main point is that he was independent for a long time. I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas. Barnabas is Paul's partner on that first missionary journey, Acts 13 and 14. That the first intentional missionary journey that we know of in Christian history. Barnabas, Paul's friend and confidant, the one who introduced Paul to the Jerusalem apostles, taking Titus along also. Titus, of course, we have the letter to Titus. Titus plays a pretty prominent role in what other letter that he's mentioned a lot? Anybody remember? A little test here. 2 Corinthians. Titus comes up quite a bit in 2 Corinthians. He's mentioned a couple other times, but he plays a pretty significant role there. Titus is a Gentile, right? So there's questions here that Paul doesn't answer that are interesting. Did he take Titus on purpose? Did he take him to be a test case? Or did it just happen this way? We actually don't know exactly. But we do know, I went up according to a revelation and presented to them the gospel I preach among the Gentiles. Now, remember, this is the same visit as Acts 11. So this is, Agabus stands up, remember in Acts 11, and he predicts by the Spirit that there'll be a severe famine. And then the elders send Barnabas and Saul to Jerusalem. So some people think the revelation he's talking about is the revelation that Agabus received. Like all kinds of historical questions here. I lean towards it being a revelation that was given to Paul himself. Kind of a prophetic word given to Paul. But perhaps it was Agabus. Either way, whatever you say about that, Paul went up at the direct command of God himself, right? God revealed to him, you need to go to Jerusalem. And perhaps as well, God said, take Barnabas and Titus as well. Paul went up and presented to them. He doesn't actually tell us yet who the them are, but we find out that it's Peter, James, the half-brother of Jesus, and John. It's not James the Apostle. Why can't it be James the Apostle? Because he's dead, right? Acts 12. Herod Agrippa, the first, cut off his head. So it's not that James, it's James the brother. I presented to them the gospel I preach among the Gentiles, but privately to those recognized as leaders. So a lot of Pauline chronology here. I don't spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to say, I believe this is, well, let me put it this way. There's a big debate over whether this is the same meeting that we find in Acts 15. Because at that meeting, Paul and Barnabas are there, and they're debating whether Gentiles have to be circumcised to be saved. And of course, the decision is no. So many people want to say Acts 15 and Galatians 2 are the same meeting. But if they're the same meeting, Paul skipped one of the visits to Jerusalem, which seemed in Galatians. You following me? Which seems unlikely because he wants to be very careful to establish his independence. So I agree with those who say that this visit is a private visit that took place before Acts 15, and it's the Acts 11 visit where they go up and bring the money for those who are poor. I am happy to explain that more. I mean, I'm saying that, a lot of commentaries go on about this for pages and pages. Do you want any further clarification on that? Or you're like, whatever, don't bother. But privately, I wanted to be sure I was not running and had not been running in vain. Now, okay, you got to do the groups on this one for a minute. What in the world is Paul has emphasized in the strongest terms that his gospel is independent, and he got it directly from Jesus. And now he seems like he's saying, I presented the gospel to Peter, James, and John because I was afraid that I was running in vain. So what in the world is Paul saying in this verse? Did Paul have doubts about his gospel after all? Did he wonder? Is he saying, I don't know if I'm right until I talk to Peter, James, and John. But why did he wait 14 years to do it? So I want you to talk about that for a minute, because that's a really puzzling verse, right? What does he mean there? I wanted to be sure I was not running and had not been running in vain. Okay, what do we think? What do we think? Any solutions? Any guesses? Yes, I basically mainly agree with that. I think, the way I interpret this verse, Paul, which I think you're saying as well, Paul's totally sure his gospel is right, but pragmatically, he needs the apostles in Jerusalem to agree with him for his ministry to succeed. Remember, we might think, well, they're apostles and inspired by God, but apostles could stray too, right? And so Paul's thinking, if the Jerusalem apostles don't back me, everywhere I go, my opponents will wave the flag saying the Jerusalem apostles don't agree with Paul. And then Paul's ministry will be in vain, right? He's not going to, I think Paul says, I'm completely right. My gospel is completely authoritative. I have no doubts about it. But given this controversy that's arisen, I need the agreement of the Jerusalem apostles for my ministry to go anywhere. I don't need it because I lack certainty about the truth of my gospel. I need it for practical reasons. Otherwise, I'm going to be frustrated constantly by opposition. So he says, but not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, even though he was a Greek. So this is a very important verse, right? Now let me just say something here. This is the first time circumcision comes up in the letter. That this is the issue, right? Paul has not said anything to the readers yet about circumcision. Paul is not talking about, let's just set in our minds, he's not talking about Galatia, he's talking about something that happened in Jerusalem. He doesn't want to speak directly to the issue in Galatia yet. He's actually going to wait till chapter 5, till he's done all his theology to attack it, right? But here, he tells them the story of what happened in Jerusalem. And Titus is a Greek, that is, he's a Gentile, he's uncircumcised. And what is the case? He was not compelled. Notice that Greek word there, anagkaste. He was not compelled. We're going to see that word again. We're going to see it 3 times in this letter. So from anagkadzo. So that's an important word. He was not compelled to be circumcised. That is, the Peter, James, and John said, no, Titus does not need to be circumcised as a Gentile to be saved. Then, by the way, the grammar in Greek here is very hard because Paul breaks a lot of grammatical rules here, which he does sometimes, right? Grammar is an interesting thing, but we won't get into it. It's too complicated. But verse 4, this matter arose because some false brothers had infiltrated. By the way, that verb pares elthon has the idea of sneaking into a group with bad motives, right? So that the English word infiltrated has that sense. That's a good translation there. They kind of crept in and snuck in to their ranks. Notice what Paul calls them, false brothers. He doesn't say, remember, these people believe Jesus is the Messiah. They say Jesus is Messiah, but Paul says they're not Christians. Isn't that interesting? They're not, these people are false brothers, and they entered in to spy out our freedom. So isn't that's fascinating that he uses the word freedom. Here, it clearly means freedom from the law, right? Freedom from having to be circumcised. They came to spout on the freedom we have in Christ Jesus in order to enslave us. So Paul speaks very negatively about these false brothers, but we did not give up and submit to these people for even a moment. Well, in Greek, it's for even an hour, but a moment is a good translation. So that the truth of the gospel, we're going to see that phrase again, would be preserved for you. So, when Paul went to Jerusalem, he had a private meeting. We'd love to know more about this. He hasn't even named him yet, but he has a private meeting with Peter, James, and John. For some reason, the issue arose, what should we do with Titus? Some people came in and said, Titus is a Gentile. He needs to be circumcised to be saved. The Jerusalem apostles and Paul said, absolutely not. And they resisted it. And the false brothers, people who aren't really Christians, were defeated. So that's where we are so far. You want to say anything about that? Any questions? This is a story of what happened in Jerusalem, not what happened in Galatia. But obviously, he's telling them the story so that they'll act the same way in Galatia. Yeah. I think that's a very helpful text. I think there is a self-righteousness in it then for them. They look good. They look impressive. So I remember in 9th grade, I don't know motives of this guy's heart. I was too young to know. But I was at a Catholic school, and our basketball coach was known in the community, and I don't think he was saved as my life went on, but I wasn't saved then, but he was known as super moral. And he had such a great reputation. All of us looked up to him like we're all ordinary people, but he is good. He is so good. He's so moral. And I think it's something like that. That'd be very much commended. So, yeah, that's a great question. Okay. Now, from those who are recognized as important, or that could be translated from those, literally, from those who are thought to be something, but that's a good translation. But from those who are recognized as the important people, the somethings, recognized by other Christians, who's he talking about? Peter, James, and John, right? From those who are recognized important, what they were formerly makes no difference to me. God does not show favoritism. So, I think he's thinking here that they walked and talked with Jesus, right? What they once were. Apostles of Jesus who walked and talked with him. It's almost inevitable, right? Everybody's like, you were an apostle of Jesus? Wouldn't you feel that way? Man, I'd love to meet you. I'd love to hang out with you. And what they once were, Paul says, it's almost shocking. He goes, I don't care. I don't care. It makes no difference to me. God does not show favoritism. So I've always really loved this verse. I think it's really a powerful verse. I don't think Paul is disrespecting them. I think Paul respects them. But he doesn't. So I'm just going to write this out because he respects them, but doesn't venerate them. He doesn't. He says, don't put them in too high of a place. We've had problems with this in the United States recently, maybe all through history probably, but some pastors were so given so much authority that they use that authority in ways that weren't helpful, and they've really fallen from the ministry even, and because of course some pastors aren't respected enough, but sometimes they're venerated too much, and that's a problem too, right? There's a balance. Respect, honor pastors, but don't venerate them. They're just human beings at the end of the day. So Paul's walking a tightrope here. Remember, he's under attack. So he's saying, look, I respect these people, but he says, I don't just agree with what they say because they're apostles. And what does he say? From those recognized as important, they added nothing to me. That sounds kind of arrogant, doesn't it? I got nothing from those guys. But what he means is my gospel was independent, right? I don't think Paul's saying I didn't learn anything ever from any of the apostles. But I do think he's saying I had the gospel apart from them. They added nothing significant to my gospel. So that's verse 6. So I love that principle for leaders. I don't know your community. Some communities, it's very common sometimes pastors aren't respected enough, right? They're not honored enough. There's communities I know in the United States where leaders are not recognized to be leaders. So that's a problem too, isn't it? And then you can fall into the trap of overestimating a leader, almost venerating them. So there's that balance. Anyway, on the contrary, right, they added nothing to me. they saw, this is the epistles, that I had been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, just as Peter was for the circumcised. So Peter, James, and John saw that Paul had been entrusted with the gospel for the Gentiles, Peter for the Jews. And then he emphasizes this, since the one at work in Peter for an apostleship to the circumcised was also at work in me for the Gentiles. What is he emphasizing here? Equality, right? He was at work in Peter. He was at work in me. So when James, Cephas, and John, James, the half-brother of Jesus, Cephas, that's Peter, John, the brother of James, those recognized as pillars. So they're the pillars. They're the important guys. And I think Paul has in mind the church as a temple. What are the pillars of the temple? It's the apostles. I don't think Paul's denying that. The church is built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets. So yeah, they are pillars in the temple, so to speak. When they acknowledged or recognized the grace that had been given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to me and Barnabas. Now, it's easy to miss this. That's the climax of the passage, right there. In fact, if you do know Greek, this is you have a participle, seen, when they saw or recognized, but we could make that, if you know Greek, we could make that a causal participle, because they saw that I was entrusted, and because they recognized gnontes. Do you recognize gnosko in there? So there's the shortening of our verb gnosko. Because they saw that I was entrusted with the gospel, and because they recognized the grace that was given to me, James and Cephas and John, those who were viewed as pillars, and here comes our main verb, finally, gave the right hand of fellowship to me and Barnabas. And there it is. That's the climax, right? Because, so I think it's easy. First of all, sort of like what Josh said, people look forward to the later parts of the Galatians, so they can miss the argument here. But the argument's very important for Paul, and the argument is, we finally get to it after everything Paul said. First he said they didn't require Titus to be circumcised. What's the next argument? They gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. And he's saying to the Galatians, hello, hello, hello. The apostles agreed with me and Barnabas, not the false teachers. They gave us the right hand of fellowship. They said that we should go to the Gentiles, and they to the Jews, the circumcision. So, remember the two charges? You're dependent on Jerusalem. What does Paul say in chapter 1? No, I am not. I'm independent. What's the other charge? And you distorted what the 12 apostles teach. This is chapter 2. No, I did not. They agree with my gospel. Remember what Paul said. If they disagree, I run in vain. But I'm not running in vain. Listen, you Galatians, the apostles agree with me, not with these guys. Don't be listening to them. The apostles agree with me. They gave us the right hand of fellowship. So that's really important. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, after talking about the resurrection, and talking about, right, God appearing, or Christ appearing to Cephas, the 12, the 500, James. There's James, right? Then he appeared to James. Last of all to me. Whether then it is I or they, so we proclaim and so you have believed. We preach the same gospel. We all proclaim it together. That is really important. So I'm really trying to drill this home. It is very important that first Paul says he's independent, and then he says he hasn't distorted, right? Because he doesn't, there's a sense in which he doesn't need Jerusalem, and there's a sense in which he does, pragmatically, right? You with me? So now he can say, they recognized the gospel. They asked only that we would remember the poor, which I had made every effort to do. And that really fits well if this is the famine relief visit of Acts 11, verse 27, when Agabus comes down and says there's a severe famine. The disciples send the gift through Barnabas and Saul. So Paul's not even saying in Galatians 2, I never remembered the poor. He's saying, no, we did remember the poor. So, you with me? That is such a crucial argument for this section. Any questions or comments? Yeah. Yeah, well, I would just want to emphasize again, I think he's talking about poor believers. Poor believers, and that's what's fundamental. Well, of course, I don't know the situation here at all, but I would say, and I don't even know every church in the United States, I can just say for our fellowship, there would be no believer in our bodies who did not have sufficient food and covering that we would not be caring for. And I think that is incumbent upon every church in terms of the members of their church, those who are committed to the body, unless finances are so difficult you can't do that. Now, I mean, so many things we could talk about, right? I mean, Paul does say if somebody's not willing to work, don't let them eat. So if somebody refuses to work and they're able to work, Paul's not talking about someone who just can't find a job, but someone who refuses to work. Then he says, don't help them, right? So that we have to take that into account as well. He's not just saying, well, the person's poor, but they refuse to work. Then Paul says, don't help them. But yes, if you have poor in the community, in your church, and they're working and they're doing the best they can, and they don't have sufficient means, then they need to be helped. And that was a vital witness of Christians really all through history. So, yeah. Yes, I think he is focused on the poor in Jerusalem because he talks about them. So this is interesting. There's a collection for the poor in Jerusalem, poor believers, poor Christians, right? I should say that. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 4, 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9, and again in Romans 15, 22 through 29. So Paul talks about this 3 other places. And, 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, it's 2 chapters. Oh, wait, I didn't do that right. 22 and through 29. What basically his argument is, the Jews have blessed, I need to be precise. Jewish Christians have blessed Gentile Christians spiritually, so Gentiles should help Jewish Christians. Man, I can't type today. Materially. That's basically his argument. I think that especially applied in the first generation. I don't think that same imperative lies upon us today. But I think Paul's arguing there was a unique role that Gentiles should play at that point in history in supporting the Jews, because the gospel had come through the Jews to the Gentiles. I mean, at least obviously there's a point there that Jewish believers should not be discriminated against today. Yeah. So, but I think Paul's argument is, look, there's a special gospel responsibility in this case.